American soldiers rely on the most sophisticated technology available. If you think this is the result of 21st century innovation, think again. Try the 19th century. It was unprecedented Civil War advancements in weapons, communication, transportation, sea power, and even news coverage that set the technological standard for the art of war. Now, Civil War tech on Modern Marvels. Iraq, 2003. America invades with the most modern weapons and tactics ever conceived. However, the technology employed to bring the enemy to its knees in only a matter of weeks is directly descended from another conflict, fought more than 140 years ago, the American Civil War.
The Civil War was the first of the great modern wars. In its 4 short years, warfare evolved some 500 years to what it had been.
Beyond any shadow of a doubt, there's a very direct correlation between the technology used in the American Civil War and the technology being used in today's military.
In fact, newfound discoveries, such as the first Union ironclad warship, the USS Monitor, raised from its 140-year-old watery grave in 2002, reveal a quantum leap in technology beyond any previous conflict.
Today's modern warship was born right here. This is the first instance of the movable turret that allowed every gun to be brought to bear on any target. This was the death knell of the old system. The armored protection for guns was born here. This is the granddaddy of them all, the USS Monitor.
The technology of the Civil War reaches back to the Industrial Revolution that began in the last decades of the 18th century in England. It was a time of profound transformation that resulted in new manufacturing processes. By the 1850s, the Industrial Revolution was firmly established in America.
Well, I think the key components in the Industrial Revolution is the idea of using machinery to do what used to be done by hand. And also, with machine-made production, you have interchangeability. And with interchangeability, you can mass produce things.
By the mid-19th century, mass production industries had been developed mainly in the North, which controlled 80% of U.S. factories. But in 1860, 84% of all Southerners worked in agriculture. The cotton industry was booming in the South. The differences between these two separate societies, coupled with the issue of slavery, set the stage for the conflict. Industrial technologies were transformed from peacetime to war.
The Industrial Revolution harnessed man's intellect with interchangeable parts to create some of the most devastating killing devices known to man in that era.
At the beginning of the Civil War, infantry soldiers were armed with the smoothbore muzzle-loading musket, in use since the 1600s. The weapon was time-consuming to load, and its rate of fire was 3 rounds per minute, with an accurate range of under 100 yards.
This is a smoothbore muzzle-loading musket. Paper cartridge containing the bullet and powder will be withdrawn from the cartridge box. The cartridge will then be formed with the teeth. The powder charge will be dumped down the barrel, and the ramrod will be withdrawn. You'd use the ramrod to ram the cartridge down the musket barrel. Then the musket could be cocked, take a priming cap, place it on the nipple, and the musket will be ready to fire.
The American muzzleloader was grossly inaccurate because a ball did not fit tightly in the muzzle or the barrel of a gun. Once the gun was discharged, the ball literally did not cling to the barrel. It bounced around from left to right or up or down as it left the barrel.
Two new technological innovations dramatically improved the accuracy and range of the weapons used during the Civil War. The first was rifling. The process involved cutting spiral grooves into the inside of the gun barrel. This gave the projectile a spiral twist as it was fired, increasing the accuracy. Rifling, practiced since the 1600s, was done by hand. However, by the time of the Civil War, rifling a barrel with a machine lathe was far more precise, and weapons could be mass-produced.
This machine operated and had a cutting edge in it. And as the barrel was turned around that cutting edge, it would groove into the barrel and you'd have rifling.
Then, the round musket ball, in use since the 1400s, was redesigned into a cone-shaped slug about ½ an inch in diameter and 1 inch long.
It is largely attributed to a Frenchman, Claude Minié. He invented or conceived of a ballistic-shaped missile.
At first it was called the Minié ball, but Americans simply referred to it as the mini ball. When fired, the gases expelled from the powder expanded the mini ball into the rifling grooves of the gun barrel, causing the projectile to spiral at an accelerated velocity, making it go farther, faster, and straighter.
The mini ball gave us the capability to fight at long range and to engage troops at a distance of 2, 3, or up to 400 yards. It was long range fighting.
From 1861 and throughout the war, over 1.5 million Springfield rifled muskets were mass-produced, most of which were purchased by the Union Army. The Springfield's rate of fire was still 3 rounds a minute. However, its range was vastly improved to 500 yards.
This is an 1861 Springfield muzzleloader.
Since the Union invested in the Springfield early in the war, it became the basic infantry weapon used in the conflict. However, weapons technology continued to improve with a rifle that loaded from the breech, or back end of the barrel. A popular breech loader model was the Sharps carbine rifle, used by the Union cavalry in the first 3 years of the war. The Sharps rifle rate of fire was up to 10 rounds a minute, with an accurate range of 1,200 yards.
In order to load the rifle, the shooter would drop the breech, insert the cartridge with the bullet and powder, insert it into the chamber, raising the breech block, trimming the back of the cartridge off, exposing the powder to the primer. The nipple would then be primed with a percussion cap, the hammer would be cocked, and the rifle would be fired.
And this, again, would be an incredible innovation at that time when you could only get in 1 or 2 shots from the old single-loaded muzzle loaders of that time. So these new breech loaders will be a very definite link across the ages between the Civil War and modern-day weaponry.
Firepower continued to improve when B. Tyler Henry invented a rapid-fire rifle. From 1862 to 1866, 13,000 Henry repeater rifles were manufactured. Its rate of fire was up to 30 rounds per minute, with an accurate range of 1,000 yards.
This is the Henry. It is a repeater. It's a 13 shot. To load it, slide the magazine follower all the way forward, unlock the magazine tube.
Its spring-loaded magazine used a fully self-contained rimfire metallic cartridge.
When you close it, hold your follower, follow your ammunition down, lever the action, which will bring a shell up. Already got another one in the chamber.
The soldiers were so enamored with the Henry rifle that they finally said you could load it on Sunday and fire it all week.
Commanders never realized the effectiveness, the deadliness of these weapons in plotting strategy. They still resort to the old mass and maneuver traditions of the 19th century, sending waves of men forward, literally to their deaths. You see this no more tragically than in Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg, where 15,000 men started across that field. Half of them were killed before they got to the Union lines.
Fire!
The same technological advancements that accompanied the rifle were also introduced to the cannon. Before the war, the typical cannon was a muzzle-loading, smoothbore weapon with a rate of fire of 3 rounds a minute and a range of 2,000 yards.
Fire! This cannon is a muzzle-loading cannon. It loads the ammunition down the barrel, and the men on the front of the gun do all the cleaning of the barrel, and they also do the loading of the new round. The men at the rear of the gun prime the piece and fire the piece. Fire! This cannon was very effective at close range, but had an effective range of only 1 mile. It could lob a shell up to 1.5 miles, but it could not place it on target properly.
Robert Parker Parrott, a retired Union artillery captain who turned to metal foundry work as a civilian, made advances in the technology of manufacturing cast iron, which allowed industry to create stronger cannon barrels that could be rifled.
The Parrott is deadly at 3,200 yards, almost 2 miles. So artillery efficiency, artillery deadliness almost doubles thanks to simply the concept of rifling a cannon barrel.
Toward the end of the war, long-range weapons such as the rifled-barreled breech-loading cannon were imported from Europe. Its rate of fire was up to 6 rounds a minute, with a range of 2 miles.
The breech loading system has a wedge in the back of the gun which allows you to open it and expose the chamber. At that point, you place a projectile in and your charge bag. It's tamped home. You're allowed to slide the breech closed and lock the breech. And the piece is ready to fire. Fire!
It is from the breech loading and the rifling of Civil War cannon that today's modern artillery come. The connection is direct and unbroken.
Civil War battles were not only fought on land. Sea power played a pivotal role in the war between the states. The navies on both sides searched for ways to control ports and the high seas. The tactical solution would come from shipbuilding technology that would change the course of maritime history. Today's United States Navy is the most powerful armada the world has ever known. From mighty warships to undetectable nuclear submarines, it has an uncompromised global reach. All these modern naval warships have one thing in common: a frame and hull of metal. The effective use of metal was first realized with ironclad ships during the Civil War.
Civil War ironclads sort of made the molds from which every military vessel from then on was cast.
Deploying conventional wooden warships of the time, the primary strategy of the Union was to create a complete naval blockade of the southern states. It was called the Anaconda Plan.
Like the beast that it's named after, the anaconda, of course, strangles its prey. And that was the idea that the Union had, was to strangle the Confederacy by blockading her ports. The Confederacy's answer to the Anaconda Plan was one word: ironclads.
In 1861, the Confederates raised the Merrimac, a sunken Union ship, and attached armor plating, creating one of the first ironclad ships. The vessel was renamed the CSS Virginia. It was an enormous warship, 262 feet in length, with a beam of 51 feet, weighing 3,200 tons. It was protected by 4 inches of iron plating and with a top speed of 8 knots, it took the Virginia half an hour to make a 180-degree turn.
And so the Virginia becomes kind of a hybrid ship. She's not a sailing vessel, but she's not going to be too far away from the technology that came before her, in that she was still going to have to fight broadside.
While the South was busy turning the Merrimack into the Virginia, the North found out about the top-secret project through spies. So the Union built its own secret weapon, the ironclad Monitor. John Ericsson, a Swedish designer, conceived and designed the novel steam-powered warship.
It was an incredibly brilliant design. It broke the bonds of the conventional ship design.
The Monitor was smaller than the Virginia, with a length of 173 feet, with a beam of 41 feet, weighing 987 tons. Its top speed was 8 knots. 8 inches of armor protected the innovative gun turret, which used 2 steam-powered engines to revolve 360 degrees.
In that it allowed a relatively small vessel with a relatively few number of guns, in this case 2. It could bring both guns to bear at a target at any angle to the vessel.
In the first confrontation between 2 ironclads, the Monitor met the Virginia at Hampton Roads Harbor, off the state of Virginia, in 1862. The Confederate vessel was already at battle, having crippled or sunk several Union wooden naval vessels, when the Monitor entered the scene.
When the Virginia encounters the Monitor, the Virginia seems to have the advantage. She has 10 guns to the Monitor's 2. However, the Monitor has something that no other ship in the world at that time had, a revolving gun turret.
The Monitor was hit 22 times, and the Virginia 20 by cannon fire during their 4-hour battle. However, neither vessel achieved a clear victory, since all the shells bounced off the armor. In the end, the battle was a draw, with each side believing it had won. The 2 ironclads never fought again. However, the real victory went to a future of iron and steel warships.
A new technology had overcome naval weapons, and thereafter, woe befall any nation that continued to build wooden frigates, because the ironclads were now here.
Although never sunk in battle, the Monitor was lost during a storm on New Year's Eve in 1862. More than 100 years later, in 1973, the Monitor was discovered in 240 feet of water, 16 miles off the coast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Through painstaking effort, parts of the vessel have been raised, including the famous revolving turret. The prized artifact was taken to the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, where it rests today. It's housed in an enormous tank, containing a solution which will gradually remove the salt that has accumulated during almost a century and a half on the ocean floor. However, on this rare occasion, the Mariners Museum has agreed to empty the tank for modern marvels, so that we may take our cameras inside this revolutionary historic monument. The process takes hours, but eventually we set eyes on a true technological wonder. When the Monitor sank, it turned and rested on the bottom upside down. So to preserve its fragile state, the turret remains inverted in the tank.
Monitor's turret is a truly unique place. We are one of the few people to be inside of it since it sank in 1862. This is the device, if you would, that revolutionized naval warfare. During the course of the battle with the CSS Virginia, the Monitor's turret was hit many times by her artillery, including this potentially devastating hit, which distorted all 8 layers of the armor and did not break through. Here are the Monitor's 2 gun ports. These were the openings in the turret for the guns to fire out of. And when the guns weren't firing out of them, they became weak spots in the turret's armor. So to make up for that, they had these large port stoppers.
As each of the Monitor's cannons fired, it recoiled backwards and was loaded from the muzzle. This left an open port. To protect the crew from enemy fire, a 1,200-pound wrought iron block was moved into place by a system of pulleys. Each time a gun fired, the port stoppers swung into place to cover the open hole.
During the battle, there were 21 men inside here, plus the 2 guns. It was dark, it was smoky, it must have been hellishly loud. The enemy fire clanging off the outside of the turret. The guns themselves roaring and leaping. They were stretching the technology of the time to build this, and it proved to be quite successful. The modern warship was born in the turret of the USS Monitor in the year 1862.
Whether on sea or land, transportation of troops and supplies is a centerpiece to any military battle plan. Civil War commanders realized this all too well and depended on new technology that accelerated transport strategy beyond any previous wartime conventions. The modern military depends on a sophisticated transportation network to move troops and materiel to combat zones anywhere in the world. Civil War strategists made a monumental leap over their predecessors by employing a new mode of transportation: the Iron Horse.
The railroads were relatively new innovation in American transportation. And the military grabbed a hold of this technology to begin to utilize it both strategically and to move both people, goods, munitions, very much like the modern military today.
In 1860, a locomotive engine could travel at speeds of up to 35 miles per hour. A horse and wagon fully loaded could at best do 12 to 15 miles per hour.
Those generals who kept railroads in mind generally succeeded. Any general who ignored a railroad would generally lose. In the autumn of 1863, an entire Union Corps, something like 20,000 plus men, were transported by train from Virginia to Tennessee. That would have been out of the question in earlier times.
The workhorse for the military on both sides was the American Type 440 engine. Its streamlined power design was reliable and durable. The fuel source was wood or coal burned in the engine's firebox. The heat changed the water in the boiler to steam, which was driven through pipes to the pistons. The pistons generating a back and forth motion were connected to the main rod. This rod was attached to the wheels, creating a rotation, propelling the engine.
And we'll look at the mechanics who are running the locomotive, and the engineer, of course, had to be an expert at doing this, because actually, with this boiler, he was sitting on a bomb. If he didn't control the water level of the boiler, he could have a boiler explosion.
The actual mechanics to operate the engine were quite simple. The fireman loaded the wood or coal in the firebox. This is the Johnson bar for forward or reverse. The engine's speed was regulated by this throttle lever. Pull back to accelerate or push forward to slow down. But the main focus for the engineer was the amount of water and steam regulated to the engine.
The water level in the boiler had to be maintained at the proper level. The engineer had 3 gauges to determine that level. He would always want the water to be above the first gauge, never to the 3rd gauge. But the important thing is, if the water is too low, this could cause a boiler explosion. If he opened this valve here and got steam out of it rather than water, he's in a lot of trouble.
In 1860, the North had about 21,000 miles of track, while the South had some 9,000 miles. However, without a system to manage all parts of the transportation network, nothing would go anywhere. In January 1862, the United States War Department created an agency called the U.S. Military Railroad. Since at the time, the military had no experience in modern transportation, the Union employed civilian experts. Herman Haupt, a civil engineer who had constructed private railroads, was drafted to make the trains run on time.
This is actually the first time in American history where the federal government took over and formed its own private corporation to run a transportation system. Herman Haupt actually did this by purchasing locomotives, funding them, and creating his own railroad inside the federal government.
His greatest achievement probably came in the Gettysburg campaign. He sent in crews, they built a new railroad. Herman Haupt was sending up about 1,500 tons of supplies per day to that army. Not only is that amazing, but the trains going back were not empty. He placed the wounded soldiers from Gettysburg on their trains, and some 15,000 of them were taken to military hospitals at railheads such as Baltimore and Washington. It was a truly incredible accomplishment. There are about 7,000 books on Gettysburg. Very few ever mention Herman Haupt's name. He should be one of the leading heroes of that campaign.
As the Civil War raged on and the North began moving into Southern territory, Union trains encountered a huge technological obstacle that literally stopped them dead in their tracks.
Railroad gauge in America is the distance between the two rails. In the North, standard gauge was, say, this wide. In the South, many of the railroads were like this wide, so the equipment couldn't fit on the tracks. It was that simple.
The Northern Railroad track width, or gauge, was 4 feet 8.5 inches wide, derived from the British who pioneered railroad technology. However, the South used a variety of gauge. There was no standardized width for the tracks.
Many of the armies literally had to pick up the tracks in the South and relay the track beds to standard gauge so that their locomotives could run on them. One of the great results of the American Civil War through the standardization of gauges north and south was the creation of a near national network of railroading for the first time in American history.
Once an army has been transported to the battlefield, communication and coordination are essential for every military operation. During the Civil War, orders sent by foot or horseback could take hours or days. A breakthrough technology gave commanders the unprecedented ability to communicate messages in mere seconds. In Iraq, today's military relies on an enormous telecommunication network to keep command and control in constant contact with troops at the front. At the same time, modern media can now transmit live broadcasts instantaneously from any remote war zone. But the first instant communication on the battlefield occurred during the American Civil War.
One can make a good parallel between the telegraph and the railroad. Both shaped the course of the Civil War, both the foundations of modern-day transportation and communication.
Samuel Morse, its inventor, sent the world's first telegraph message from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Maryland in 1844. The telegraph key is simply a switch that turns on or off electric current. As the sender taps out a message, the switch completes a circuit, which allows current to flow into the coil of the receiving machine. The iron bar above the coil is magnetized and attracts a second iron bar below it. When the key is released, shutting off the current, a spring forces the two bars apart. This attraction and deflection movement taps out the message on the receiving end.
There's 50,000 miles of telegraph cable in this country, and in 1861, about the time of the start of the war, there's a cable reaching from New York to San Francisco.
In wars past, orders from commanders were sent by foot, horseback, or even carrier pigeon. Hours or even days passed before the information was received.
The problem with the written dispatch, first it was on paper, second it could be lost, third it could be intercepted, and you really never know if that written dispatch ever made it to its destination.
The telegraph reduced the time to send and receive a message to seconds, and afforded generals an obvious advantage to outmaneuver the enemy.
At 11 o'clock, if a general wants troops, he can push the telegraph key. At 11:01, at some distant place, the troops are being alerted to get ready to move. It changes the face of war.
When the Civil War began, telegraph lines were quickly erected everywhere the armies traveled. By the end of the war, more than 15,000 miles of telegraph lines had been built by both sides for military purposes only. The armies developed mobile telegraph units that could travel with the troops. General Ulysses S. Grant was a chief proponent of the new technology.
What Grant did was basically get control of a continent. He had communications with a continent, and he is running a military operation that stretches for thousands of miles.
The War Department opened its own telegraph office, and President Abraham Lincoln frequently spent hours receiving information about the war.
It's probably one of the better examples of technology in warfare as to what was put down in 1861 and what we are using today.
Use of the telegraph not only benefited the military, it also resulted in huge changes for the newspaper industry.
The technology for the delivery of news during the Civil War was akin to the technology we have today in the sense that people had never experienced such rapid delivery of news about the war and its images.
Civil War journalists were the first embedded reporters, covering the first instant news war. More than 500 correspondents covered the war from home front to front line, and the competition was fierce.
The New York Herald during the Civil War spent something like $100,000 a year on war reporting, between paying correspondents and paying for telegraph charges.
Once news reports sped from the front via telegraph, a newly developed high-speed printing press, perfected by Philadelphia inventor William Bullock, churned out newspapers at an astonishing rate. Prior to Bullock's press, only 1,500 news copies an hour could be printed by a hand press.
Bullock's patented steam-powered press, which could produce about 10,000 pages an hour, and operated by feeding off a continuous roll of newsprint rather than requiring individual sheets of newsprint being fed into the press, and had the advantage over the older presses of printing both sides of the newspaper at once.
The telegraph and high-speed presses signaled a giant leap forward for mass media. For the first time, it was possible to read what happened on a distant battlefield just days after it occurred.
Crowds would wait outside the big dailies in New York, waiting for the news. The newspapers got used to publishing extra editions.
The Civil War was also the first major conflict to be captured on camera. Matthew Brady and his associates recorded the images of war and brought them to the American public. Employing what is called a wet plate process, photographers used chemically treated glass plates that could actually be developed on the battlefield.
This technological marvel captured realistic images showing the devastation of our soldiers, the agony on their faces, and the absolute horrors of war firsthand in studio fashion.
Technology may have fueled the misery of war. However, innovations in battlefield medicine and field rations would make a soldier's life somewhat more bearable. Today's American armed forces benefit from some of the best food and medical care in military history. The concepts of providing soldiers with portable, nutritious meals and employing life-saving combat medical procedures took giant steps forward during the Civil War.
Many of the technological advances, advances in surgery, sanitation, dietetics, can all be traced directly back from our modern military today, right back to the American Civil War.
Getting food to the troops during any conflict is always top priority. However, during the initial phases of the Civil War, soldiers existed on a biscuit wafer made of water and flour that was almost impossible to chew, appropriately known as hardtack.
Occasionally they would get salted beef, but you had to be careful of the beef because more often than not it's going to be rancid. But hardtack and coffee were the basic diets, and this is why digestive systems among these soldiers are going to be seriously impaired.
Civil War brass employed a new technology that would supply the troops with healthy, unspoiled food anywhere on the front lines. Canned food. Annual production of canned foods increased from 5 million to 30 million by the end of the Civil War. Surprisingly, some Civil War canned products have endured to today, such as Underwood deviled ham, Lee and Perrin's Worcestershire sauce, Borden's condensed milk, and Van Camp's pork and beans. The canning process dates back to 1795 in France, when Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was concerned about keeping his armies fed. Nicolas Appert conceived the idea of preserving food in bottles, like wine. He realized if food is sufficiently heated and sealed in an airtight container, it won't spoil. By the 1800s, bottles were replaced by tin cans. And in 1858, food cans became mass-produced when a Baltimore oyster canner dramatically sped up the cooking process.
Isaac Solomon discovered that by adding salt to water, it increased the boiling point of water, and therefore they could cook the food more quickly.
The process of combining salt with water requires more heat to bring water to a boil. Since the water temperature is hotter, the food inside the cans cooks faster, reducing the preparation time from 5 or 6 hours to 30 minutes.
They increased from 2,000 cans a day to 20,000 cans a day, therefore increasing the process and making the food safer for shipment in the cans across the country.
The Union Army took advantage of this canning technology immediately. Soon, fruits, vegetables, and meats found their way to the camps in cans.
The rations the men are using today go right straight back to the innovation of canned goods in the 1860s.
With better prepared and preserved rations, troops certainly ate healthier. However, life on the front line was still a deadly business. During the Civil War, an estimated 250,000 soldiers died on the battlefield. At the start of the war, fallen men were cared for by a woefully underqualified, understaffed, and undersupplied medical corps. In many circumstances, a wounded soldier would languish on the battlefield for days before being retrieved.
The military hierarchy, the top brass, if you will, was still very much of the feeling that the medicine should wait until the battle is over.
Dr. Jonathan Letterman, medical director of the Union Army, was considered the father of battlefield medicine. Letterman developed a rescue system for evacuating the wounded and established ambulances operated by dedicated military personnel assigned to each regiment. A wounded soldier could now be taken off the battlefield and admitted into a field hospital within hours.
This is a typical ambulance wagon, outfitted with water cask and empty stretchers used to evacuate wounded soldiers from the battlefield carnage. Typically, these wounded were stacked laterally left and right, too high, as they were evacuated from the battlefield to the rearward hospitals.
Anesthesia, such as chloroform, was introduced in the 1840s, but had its first widespread use during the war. For more efficient delivery, new devices were developed for its use.
This is called the Chisholm inhaler. It was developed by the Confederacy. By having a small sponge inside, we are able to concentrate 100% of the ether or chloroform into the patient. A few drops were to be put on the screen. It would then be inserted into the nose of the patient, and a very small quantity of chloroform or ether could then render the patient unconscious.
Civil War surgeons not only saved lives on the battlefield, but with new technology, they were the first to attempt cosmetic and reconstructive surgery after a patient recovered.
Men who had very traumatic wounds, especially to the face, that affected their appearance, could actually find relief from a surgeon who could reconstruct that part of the face that was very badly damaged. We have one excellent example of a soldier. The wound included parts of his nose, his cheekbone, and his upper lip, very badly damaged. The cosmetic surgery closed the hole in the wound, but of course left severe scarring. A prosthetic device was then developed, a nose piece to cover the nose, a large mustache to cover the missing part of the upper lip, was hung on a pair of glasses. The glasses could be placed on, the nose then would be in the correct place, and he could lead a very normal life, appearing to be very normal to anyone who saw him on the street.
Amputation was a common surgical technique performed on patients with severe wounds. However, new prosthetics came of age during the Civil War that gave patients maximum mobility after surgery.
We have a leg here, just a peg leg like you would expect to see on a pirate, very heavy, made of heavy leather, wood, and metal, not very functional, not very good looking, and not very comfortable for the wearer. On the other hand, we have a very technologically advanced arm from 1863. It has vent holes to allow for free air circulation. We have an articulated elbow for natural movement. We have an opposable thumb on a natural hand. That thumb can actually allow the wearer to grasp. And over the whole arm, we have a paint color that is going to more closely approximate human skin color. This is the technological beginnings of modern prosthesis. It started a trend of fit and function that today is seen in the modern sea leg. The sea leg is the most modern leg used by the United States military.
Today's battlefield medicine, along with advancements in weapons, warships, transportation, and communication, can all trace their technological origins back to the war that altered the course of American history. And now this technology helps the American military in the 21st century.
The technologies we have today in war, as well as the technologies we're going to have tomorrow in war, all go back to the Civil War itself, where for the first time in history, men began to use technology, and they used it with a capital T, knowing that this is the way wars have to be fought.
Fire!